Hey guys, I'm back with another video. I had a special request earlier today for how to use the analog switches. So let's see what we can do with them. Each one of the stick assemblies, each axis of the sticks, has a switch associated with it, to where as you move the stick, say I'm going to move the aileron, you see it's in position 1, and as I move it to the left, it switches to position 0. And it did that at 75%. See, it's at 100% now. So as I come back towards center, releasing pressure on the stick, as it passes 75, it switches back to position 1. And as I push it to the right, and it passes minus 75% over here, then it switches to position 2. So each axis has this. And in the past, I have set the rudder to 85%, so that when I move the rudder stick all the way against the stop, I can use the analog switch on the rudder to switch from low rates to high rates. Uh, and I call it auto rates, so that if I'm easy on the rudder, then my aileron's an elevator in low rates. But if I peg the rudder, like if I want to do a spin, if I throttle back, let the plane slow down, just as it stalls, if I throw full rudder in it, then I get high rate elevator and aileron to have more control to make the plane spin. And then when I release the rudder and the sticks, then I'm back to low rates. And as long as I keep the rudder stick between plus and minus 85%, then I'm in low rates. And I'll show you how I set that up. And then the throttle was the main question. Somebody wanted to be able to have the transmitter tell them when the throttle was at a particular position. And earlier I was playing with plus and minus 20%. And I have the voice set up to where when the throttle is below uh, a 20%, then it's, or minus 20, it says low throttle. And when it's in between plus and minus 20%, then it says mid throttle. And when you go above 20%, it says high throttle. Now you can make it say whatever you want it to say. You don't have to say high throttle or low throttle. You can just have it tell you that the throttle is between those 2 points and not say anything when it's below one of those points or above one of those points. But you can set where these change. There's 3 positions, 0 to 1 and 1 to 2. So you got position 0, 1, and 2, just like you do on a 3-position switch on the top of the case. So you can go in here and you can set this. You can use the plus and minus to move it a little bit, or you can drag the thing and then click OK. And then you can set this one. You can set it to 25, click OK. So you can set these two wherever you want them. And so you can make it announce when the stick passes, either one of the 2 points. You can't have it tell you anything when it goes all the way to idle or when it goes to full throttle, but when it switches from 0 to 1 or 1 to 2, then it will tell you when it did that. And you can go into the audio settings. If you go back to audio events and you go to switch change reports, you can add the throttle stick, and then you can have it say whatever you want it to say when it's in position 0, position 1, and position 2. That's up to you, whatever you want it to say. And then the B switch is what I use for rates. And so I have it set up for low rates, auto rates, and 3D rates. And the way I do those rates, there's 2 ways to do it. You can do it in flight modes, which is the original way I did it, because a DX9 has flight modes, but it doesn't have logical switches. So if you go to flight mode setup, What I do is I put switch B as the primary switch, and then the rudder stick, the analog switch on the rudder stick, is a second switch. And so if I'm in low rates, which is position 0 of switch B, and I move the rudder back and forth, then it just stays in flight mode 1, which is low rates. And then if I go to the middle position, which is auto rates, it's in low rates until I move the rudder stick past 85%, and then it switches to flight mode 2, which is high rates. And if I go the other way, it switches. And then if I go to position 2, which is my 3D rates, then it goes to flight mode 3, and I've renamed them to say what they are. And you go in here and you choose what you want each position of this matrix to be. But this is my setup for auto rates. And the new way of doing it with a iX14 is logical switches. And so what you can do is go in here and pick the first logical switch, and you can assign switch B for the primary switch, just like I did in flight modes, and assign the analog switch on the rudder stick as a secondary switch. And so now if I'm in low rates and I move the rudder back and forth, it stays in 0. The switch position stays in 0. And then if I go to the middle, it stays in 0 unless I move the rudder past 85% either side. And then if I go to the third position, which is 3D rates, now it's in switch position 2 of the logical switch. And as I move the rudder back and forth, it stays in position 2. So the rudder only changes what rate I'm in when it's in the center position for auto rates. And I've renamed the switch. I've given it a name, auto rates. And you can assign each, I guess, each box in this matrix. Well, actually, it's based on position. Position 0, you can set it to a certain percent. Position 1, you can set it to another percent. Position 2 to another percent. And you could use this to control another channel. I can't think of one right offhand, but the percentage output from the logical switch can be used to control a channel, but that's not what I'm doing with it in this case. In this case, it's only changing the dual rates. And if you go to dual rates and we go here, and right now I have the aileron set to auto rates, which is the logical switch. And so if I'm in position 0, which is low rates, and I move the stick back and forth, it stays in low rates. If I go to the middle, now wait a minute, it's not moving. There it does. I didn't give it enough travel. So you can see that the auto rate logical switch is making it switch from low rates with the stick, less than 85% deflected. And if I go against the stop, then it switches to the middle position and gives me high rates. If I let go of the rudder, it goes back to low rates. And if I go the other way, right rudder, then it gives me high rates again if I'm past 85%. And you can set that 85% to 80% or 90%, wherever you want it, but I use 85 to make sure it triggers when I move the stick close enough to the stop. And then the third position, which is 3D rates, then it goes to 125%. That's typically what I use for 3D rates. I leave my servo travel set to 100%, and to get extra throw, I turn the rates up. Because if you were to turn the servo travel up to 125 and left this at 100, then when you were in low rates, this would have to be a much smaller number, like 50%. And I don't like, it's the same output, the pulse width is the same, no matter which way you do it. But this way I don't have to mess with the servo travel. I'm going to mess with the dual rates anyway. So I would rather turn the dual rates up for 3D rates. right there, then turn the travel up to 125%, and then have to set, the high rates to a lower value and the low rates to an even lower value and stuff. So this way I only have to put 125 here, and I can leave the servo travel alone. But now if I show you the elevator, it's still set up on flight modes. So it says flight mode switch, you see. So in low rates, it's giving me 75 and 20, and it's in position 1. And if I move the rudder back and forth, it doesn't change. If I go to the middle position, to auto rates, now as I move the rudder back and forth, it switches from 75% to 100% at the fully deflected position. So this is the flight modes causing this one to change, whereas it was the logical switch on aileron. And here's rudder, and it's on flight modes too. And you see it changes with the switch, the B switch in the middle. But if you go to 3D, then it goes to the 125% with 35% Expo. So you can do this auto rate thing using the logical switch or the flight modes. I'd rather use the flight modes for the flaps so that I get flight mode trim with the flaps. With the DX9, you didn't have logical switches and you had to use flight modes. But with the iX14, you can use the flight modes for the flaps and use the logical switch like I was using the flight modes for the rates. So I get to keep my flight modes on the flaps. And simply to change it, all I have to do is go to elevator and change this to auto rates, and then go to rudder and change the switch on it to auto rates. It's handy to name that switch to something you can recognize. Somebody pointed out that I tend to put Easter eggs in my videos, one of which was that I renamed the channels to say what they do, so that it's much easier to figure out which channel does what. Instead of saying aux 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, it actually says gain, or let's see, gain, gyro, in AS3X Plus, you've got stop lock, things like that. So at any rate, in servo setup, here's my Easter egg that they pointed out. I go in here and I rename these to something that tells me what their function is, instead of leaving them set to default. But if you look at all of my airplanes, most all of them say 100% here, except for flaps. I use the servo travel to set the flap travel, because in the flap system, and see, I use flight modes for that. In the flap system, I set the flap FM1 to like minus 100, and I set FM3 to plus 100, and then I set the takeoff position to 75 less than FM1. In other words, FM1 will say minus 100, and this will say minus 25, and then this one says plus 100. And then to set the travel on the flaps, I go into the servo travel. I leave these like, I just run that up to 100. I run this to minus 25, and then I run this one to plus 100. And so all of my planes look like this: minus 100, minus 25, and 100. And since I use flight mode trims, I don't use the elevator trim here. I do eventually transfer the offset of the elevator to here so that I can recenter the trims. But I go into servo setup and the travel, and I set the actual flap position using, and actually, let me go back. I lock these together, and I want these values to be identical, the up and down, because if they're not identical, the servo travels more one way than it does the other from center. So before I start setting up a plane, I will set these to like plus or minus 50%, which is not going to be near enough flap travel. And because I've got the flap system set to 100% each way. And the reason why this is 25 and 100, because if you subtract 25 from 100, that's 75. And the total travel is 200. So 75 divided by 200 is basically, I don't know, 3/8. So if full flaps is 40, I get 15 degrees for takeoff, which is what I want. But at any rate, I actually set the flap travel using the servo travel right here. And then if the flaps don't line up with the wing in the up position, then I go to sub trim and I move the sub trim to where the flaps line up. And then I go back and I look and see if I've got the proper amount of full flap travel. So I don't ever look in here after a plane setup really, so I don't see this minus 188, and I don't see like plus or minus 80 or 85 here. Whatever values these are, they both need to be the same with the opposite sign. But at any rate, having these at something other than 100 doesn't bother me. It would on all the other controls, but on the flaps it doesn't, because what I see in the flaps is the flap system menu, and this is where I make my takeoff flap adjustment and my trim. Once I set the plane up, I never look at the servo travel again. I'd rather see minus 100, plus 100, and I don't really care what the servo travel set to as long as both directions are the same value so that it's linear. But at any rate, that's, I don't know what else I can show you about that. The audio event, you can set an audio event to say what you want it to say when you move the throttle stick from position 0 to 1 into 2, which I think I've already covered that at the beginning. But at any rate, there's not any way to have the throttle stick tell you when it's at 10%, 20%, 30%, and so forth. You can only use the analog switch to tell you when it crosses the two switch points for the 3-position analog switch that's on the stick axis. Digital switch setup, that's your toggle switches, and I'm using switch C to control the stop lock in the AS3X Plus. And so when I pull the switch down to position 2, which is there, it's at 100% gain, and then position 1, which is the middle, that gives me 70% gain, and then position 0 gives me 35%, which is the default if you don't change anything in the receiver. 35 is a default, but they want you to switch it to 100% when you adjust the AS3X gain. So that's why I have it on a switch where I can go to 100, adjust the gain, and then switch it to 35 by putting the switch in the 0 position. But I covered that in my AS3X Plus setup video, so that's there. My flight mode setup on flaps is in another video. I've got a poor man's toga switch video that covers that. So I guess That's about it for analog switches. I don't know what else you can do with them other than that. So anyway, there you go. Hope that helps y'all out. Later.